Good evening. We're just awaiting the final speaker and then we'll start. Thank you.
Das Mikrofon. Hat haben wir es wieder genommen?
Nein, das kann ich nicht.
Okay, we hope he'll come. So, good evening, I'm Stefan Ruchti with the Swiss Foreign Ministry, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this side event, which is organized jointly by ACT Alliance and Switzerland, and with the support of ETH Zurich. Our side event seeks to set the concept of equity in relation to the Paris Agreement, with a specific focus on the global stocktake. Recent years have seen numerous attempts to operationalize equity and to propose a fair burden sharing across all countries. But the Global Stocktake that will evaluate global climate efforts in 2023 requires assessing equity at the global level, which is conceptually not an easy feat. It is my great pleasure to welcome a set of distinguished speakers and panelists who will help us to address the topic at hand. All the speakers and panelists would each merit a thorough introduction, so I hope you'll forgive me if, in the interest of time, I'll be very brief. We are delighted to have Rudelmar Bueno de Faria with us. Rudelmar Bueno de Faria is the General Secretary of ACT Alliance. He will introduce the issue. Franz Berre, Switzerland's Ambassador for the Environment, will equally share a few introductory words. Heading the Swiss negotiation team at COP23, Franz Berre will unfortunately have to leave us early and join another meeting, but thanks anyway for coming. Thanks a lot. Among the panelists who will delve more deeply into the topic, I'd like to welcome Alison Doig, the head of policy at ACT Alliance. Alison Doig will look at the topic from a civil society perspective and include a link to next year's facilitative dialogue, which will provide a first assessment where the international community stands with their climate efforts. Xolisa Ngwadla, who we're still waiting for, he is with the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa. He is one of the key negotiators on equity issues, including with relation to the global goal for adaptation. Xolisa Ngwadla will look at the equity issue in more general terms and relate it to the Paris Agreement. Further, we are very pleased to have Ottmar Edenhofer with us. Ottmar Edenhofer is Chief Economist at PIC Potsdam, and he has extensively worked within the IPCC, including as co-chair of one of its 3 working groups. Today, Ottmar Edenhofer will look at the interlinkage of carbon pricing, equity, and the Paris climate goals. Last but not least, we have Lukas Bretschger of ETH Zurich with us. Lukas Bretschger currently serves as president of the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, and today he will tie equity principles to the challenge of a truly globalized stocktake. I know I did not justice to any of our speakers and panelists, but dare to ask Franz Berre and Rudelmar Bruno de Faria to share their introductory remarks. Franz Berre.
Thank you very much, and let me indicate it's a big pleasure to be here, and I would also like to welcome to have the opportunity to briefly address that important issue here. I would also like, of course, to thank ACT Alliance for working together with Switzerland to organize these side events, and distinguished panelists. I'm really sad that I will not be able to listen to you, but I hope that I will be able to get your PowerPoint presentations, because it's really a very exciting topic. And I would also like to thank you, Stefan, for all the efforts you put into making that side event possible. As you may know, negotiators, they like clear concepts that lend themselves easily to discussions, concepts that lead us straight forward to implementation. And I think you have to agree that neither CBDR, CBDRRC, or whatever is such an easy conflict, and equity definitely is not such a simple concept that lends itself directly to implementation. However, it is an important concept that must lead our negotiations, because if you are negotiating an outcome that is not felt as equitable, this outcome probably will also not be fully implemented by each concerned. It is clear that the Global Stocktake in 2023 shall assess equity at the global level. At the same time, equity concepts are also highly important to determine national efforts. In Switzerland, when developing its NDCs, we were using equity consideration and also explaining them when handing in our NDC. Switzerland was also using equity consideration when determining its share to the Fast Start financing, and also when we try to determine what should be a fair share of Switzerland, which it should contribute to the 100 billion which developed countries should mobilize for developing countries each year by 2020. Of course, there are many different ways of defining or understanding what equity means. There are different concepts, and these different concepts might also lead to different results. But it is important to start with some concepts, and then also to discuss these concepts, to exchange views and to learn from each other. There are many ways to see something as equitable. There's probably not one truth, one only single truth way, but it's important to start to share its equity consideration, to exchange with each other, so that we can also criticize it, not in a negative manner, but in a motivating manner, to explain why perhaps we think equity could be looked at differently. When it comes to mitigation, a way to measuring global equity may be found in setting current global emissions in relation to the necessary emission reduction paths with a look at the intergenerational equity. I think that is a very important element also, not only look at equity between us today, but also the equity between today and the future generations. When it comes to adaptation, things might get even more complicated. And I think if you'd ask me, well, what would be the solution to look at equity guiding us for adaptation, mitigation, I think there's no clear answer. And that is the reason why it is so important to have events like this one here, where different equity concepts are presented and are discussed and can stimulate each other. I'm really sad that I'm sorry that I have to leave, but I'm looking forward to hear about the side event. I'm really looking forward also to look at the slides, and I'm looking most importantly forward to have this side event impacting the negotiations in the other zone. Thank you very much.
I'm pleased to warmly welcome you to this side event that ACT honored to co-host with the Swiss government. ACT Alliance is the world's largest Protestant and Orthodox humanitarian, development and advocacy network, with a membership of 146 organizations and a presence in over 125 countries. Our humanitarian work is continuously affected by extreme weather conditions. At the moment, we have active humanitarian operations in the Caribbean, Eastern and Horn Africa, Southeast Asia, and other parts of the world that are affected by tropical storms, droughts, and flooding. The poor and most vulnerable are hit at the hardest, and in many cases, these same communities face significant challenges of inequality, economic injustices, and unmet basic needs. Because climate change has had and continues to have a significant impact on the communities we serve and on the work we do, we see it from a human rights, sustainable development, and justice perspective. The Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reductions are important global frameworks that set the long-term agenda for action towards climate, resilient and sustainable communities. The implementation of these frameworks should be ambitious and adhere to the key principles of gender justice, human rights, and equity. It must not be further enhance injustice or disproportionately burden the poor and the most vulnerable. The Paris Agreements and the SDGs invite the participation of all countries and stakeholders. Such participation will contribute to a sustainable and climate-safe future for all. ACT Alliance, together with our ecumenical partners, will continue to mobilize resources, partnerships, and constituency to ensure that you are also contributing to solutions. We shall continue to highlight global resilience, sustainability, and solidarity with climate-vulnerable people. To this end, I'm very grateful to the government of Switzerland for the collaboration on this specific event, side event, as well as several dialogues on climate equity in the past. We trust that these conversations are helpful in further enhancing our understanding as the various aspects of the Paris Agreements continue to be elaborated. Thank you very much and welcome again to this side event.
Thank you very much, General Secretary. May I please ask you, Alison Lloyd, to look at the topic from a civil society perspective.
Good evening. So yes, I'm head of policy, but not for ACT Alliance, for Christian Aid, which is the UK member of the ACT Alliance. Christian Aid has been following these climate negotiations for 10 years now, and since the beginning of that time, we have taken climate justice, and particularly the equity issue, as one of our central themes. We have worked all that time to bring these issues in through Copenhagen, through Paris, and now into the facilitative dialogues and beyond. I wanted to thank Riddlemar for grounding this discussion in the context of the disasters that are happening, of the need for sustainable development, of the real life that this negotiation goes on in. I think that's really important. And in doing that, moved on, I just wanted to remind people the level of urgency that we're facing. And the reason why, people talk about 2 degrees, but the reason why 1.5 degrees is so important, keeping below that level. And if you were sat in this room for the previous presentations, which were about climate migration, and we had an impassioned presentation from Tuvalu, where they are desperately trying not to admit that they're going to have to evacuate. They're desperately saying we're staying, but knowing that they have a future that's uncertain. We'll realise why 1.5 is so important to stay within. And I think one of the reasons why 1.5 the scientists give is because we can come back from that. It's somewhere we can go up to. It will be an impact. We're already seeing it. But there's a way to recover. There's a way to bring it back into safer territory. As we move to 2 degrees, the natural forces come into play. The feedback loops, the methane from the Arctic, the trees the deforestation starts to happen at a rapid rate. We don't know if we can come back from that. If we go up to 3 degrees, and the NDCs, if you add them all up together, go to 3.7 degrees, if we go that far, we actually don't know what's going to happen. We can predict some of the physical outcomes but we don't know what that impact that will have on lives, on livelihoods, on economy. So do we dare take that risk? So I would say that the question really then is, how does this negotiation deliver that 1.5? How do we get ourselves on the track, back on track? We're so far off. And I think the first thing is admitting the scale of the task. We're on track to 3.7. We need to double, quadruple, move up our effort between now and 2030, not 2050. We need to move now. I think this means unprecedented cooperation between countries. We need to work together. And what that working together needs is trust. We need trust that if I'm going to take my move, you'll take it with me. That you'll do your fair share. That you're the rich country, you take on your share, you help us. do our fair share, that we actually recognise and are open to that discussion. And actually, some say that the like-minded countries and some of the developing countries are, get really angry about this issue, but it's because they see there's no trust. What trust do you have if we don't have Kyoto 2 ratified? What trust do we have if the climate finance isn't coming forward? We need to admit what we have to do, and we have to take on our fair shares. And finally, I would say that we have to then deliver through real-world situations. We can't be continually, we'll just put some money in coal over there, or we'll put it into developing diesel cars over there, if what we need to do is move to an absolute new type of economy. Now, why I said it was civil society perspectives, and I can talk with confidence that what I'm giving is a civil society perspective, is that the equity that Christian Aid and our partners and our friends have been talking about all these years has now been adopted by, and the report that we're releasing today, you've got a little postcard and you can instantly download it onto your iPhone or iPad with your QR code. This report is being supported by over 120 CSOs from around the world. That's faith groups, it's NGOs, the environmental NGOs, the development NGOs, it's justice movements, it's trade unions, it's a whole range of organisations from every continent have signed on to this calling for equity to unlock the ambition that is needed. So we need a fair outcome. And we're not saying, what we're saying is that all countries have to take that move, but they have to do it in different ways. And really the next slide is the scary slide, particularly if you're from the USA or Europe. And just very, very briefly, this is our analysis. As we say, there's many definitions of equity, but actually this analysis shows a range. The green bar is the fair shares. If you were to cut your carbon by as much as the green bar for the USA, for Europe, for China, and you're doing your fair share, and that bar shows some of that variation. Do we take responsibility back, historic responsibility back to 1990 or 1850? How much do we classify capacity in terms of our economic ability to move? How do you define the right to development? So we've taken that into consideration, which is why we have this range of what we consider fair shares. The red bar is definitely not fair. The little bars, the black bars you see across, are the NDC commitments. So the US NDC commitment is currently less than a quarter, probably about a fifth of what it should be doing. Same for the European Union. You can see that India and China are actually prepared to do about their fair share. The other stark thing in that graph is that the dotted line is, if USA was to reach that dotted line, it would have 0 domestic carbon emissions. And you think, well, how can it do more than that? But you look at, well, I wouldn't so much say China, but certainly India. You look at many of the developing countries, they have capacity to do further. They have more mitigation capacity. So the US, Europe has to be prepared to help, to fund, to support, to give technology to the poorer countries to help them go realise their potential for change, their potential to go low carbon, or their potential to leapfrog to a low carbon future. So, one last slide really, and I suppose that's relating it back to these negotiations. If we're to have a fair outcome, I think what we need is a new global era of cooperation that has equity, fairness, trust at its heart. We need to realise the urgency, upper urgency of 1.5. So I would say the facilitative dialogue really needs to open that conversation about upping the NDCs across the board. It means of implementation, that's finance, technology being transferred, genuinely cooperatively being transferred and given and coming forward. We can't forget, as we heard there from the Minister, from the representative from Switzerland, the adaptation, loss and damage. You can't be saying, I'll do this, and that really those two cannot be lost in equity. They have to be done in a fair and equitable way as well. It has to be gender fair. You have to leave no one in your solutions. There are many solutions to this problem, but they have to really be fair for all people and take, for example, gender issues in place. There must be, we know the pathway we need to take. We need a just transition. We need to look at the job changes, the decent work that's coming out of that, and plan for those changes for communities that will be affected. And we have to redirect public finance investment away from the bad and into the good, which gives me a little plug, if you allow me 1 minute, for Christian Aid, Christian Aid's campaign that's been adopted internationally, our Big Shift campaign. Our Big Shift campaign is exactly about that. How do we shift investment out of fossil fuels? And how do we get it into renewable energy? And particularly for the justice perspective, how do we get it to those 1.2 billion people around the world with no electricity or cooking on a dirty stove? So it's about those real life, we come back to that, real life actions that have to complement. You can't hide the fact you're investing in coal and fossil fuels. You have to, behind, oh, I'm doing a solar power, look, I'm here, and while you're handing money over here to the wrong. So I think that's really important. So I'll stop there. And just to remind you, do look up the report. All the detail, the technical details of the analysis can be sourced through the report as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I regret that our expert, Xolisa Nguadla, who was going to speak in particular on adaptation, which is a very hard aspect to tackle, is not with us. I guess we'll have to organize another side event as soon as possible addressing the topic of equity and adaptation, but we still have two excellent speakers with us, and if we find a way to address adaptation by any means, that would be great. But anyway, so Ottmar Edenhofer will now look at the interlinkage of carbon pricing, equity, and the Paris climate goals. The floor is yours, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to talk about this important topic on equity. When I will talk on equity and justice in my presentation, I will make a quite modest proposal. From a purely philosophical, normative point of view, you could be much more ambitious, but I want to propose a moderate proposal in order to make this proposal accessible and implementable. So let me remind us, and you know all this graph, but it seems to me it is worthwhile to recall that in the 2000s we had an era of a very strong increase of carbon emissions, an annual growth at roughly around 2% per annum. So in the last few years, probably we have stabilized the emissions, but let's see if we are really on track on stabilizing the emissions and then to decline the emissions. The reason why I'm a little bit skeptical about this is that if you look at the profile of emission reduction in the different countries, you see, for example, that in China there's a lot of things going on, in particular a strong political will to reduce local air pollution and also to reduce emissions. In the United States, we have seen so far a strong substitution of coal by gas, but still India is catching up. And if you look at the energy sources like coal, oil and gas, you can see that over the last decade we have seen a large-scale renaissance of coal. And therefore the rumors and the reports of the terminal decline of coal seems to me exaggerated and premature. Because in the next few years we have to deal, from my point of view, with the coal issue. And coal and the coal issue is one of the most important entry points for an effective climate policy, and only when we can address coal we can keep the door open for more ambitious climate goals. So what's from an economic point of view, the most important problem? The most important problem is that in Paris we have decided that we want to release only a limited amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, and here I have taken a number, roughly 800 gigatons CO2. 800 gigatons is by no means consistent with a 1.5 degree target. Even for a 2 degree target it's not safe. But I have chosen this moderate number and to compare it with the enormous amount of reserves and resource which we have underground of coal, oil and gas. So when carbon capture and storage will be available, and this means basically we have another storage underground, 70% of coal, 1/3 of oil and gas has to remain underground. If carbon capture and storage is not available due to social acceptability reasons or technical reasons, 90% of coal and 2/3 of oil and gas has to remain underground. And this is an enormous challenge. ahead of us. So basically, if you then calculate what's needed for an effective climate treaty, this basically means roughly to achieve a 2-degree target means a reduction, an annual reduction of emissions roughly around 4% per annum. And if we want to achieve a 1.5-degree target, it's roughly almost 7 to 10% per annum. This is unprecedented in economic history since industrialization. So you know all these numbers, but I would like to remind us the enormous challenge ahead of us. So I told you that basically the Paris Agreement is roughly around 800 gigaton, but this is not the goal well below 2 degrees. So for a well below 2 degrees, it's probably 600 gigatons. For a 1.5, it's much lower. But the most important aspect is that the NDCs, the national determined contributions, roughly adds up to 600 gigatons CO2 by 2030. After that, we need a dramatic reduction of emissions. When you basically calculate the existing and the planned coal-fired plants around the globe over their economic lifetime, so this adds up roughly to 380 gigatons CO2. So almost half of the 800 gigatons is absorbed by coal-fired plants. And you might argue so that China and India has revised their expansion of coal, and you are right, they have reduced their current plans significantly. But if you look at other countries like Turkey, Indonesia, Japan, Bangladesh, Philippines, you see there are very ambitious expansion of coal-fired plants. And I have shown you this slide not to blame other countries. So this is just the number of countries who are responsible for 80% of the new coal-fired capacities. But as a German, I am absolutely entitled to blame my own government. Even in Germany, we have a huge problem with coal. Since 2002, we have built 16 new coal-fired plants. And under the current debate of where basically a new government is forming, we have huge problems to come up with a reasonable proposal to phase out coal significantly. Now we have shifted domestically almost the debate from phase out of coal to electric mobility, which is an insane discussion because electric cars requires a fully decarbonized power sector when electric mobility should lead to a decline of emissions. So this is not to blame other countries. I could blame my own country and the problems we have in particular in Germany and in Europe for the phase out of coal. But now let me come to the fairness and the equity issue. Basically what we have here is in the Paris Agreement is basically a kind of a combination of a top-down and a bottom-up approach, where we basically have pledges, voluntary agreements. We basically have the UNEP gap report showing what's the emission gap, and also the UNEP gap report has emphasized the enormous importance of the coal issue and the requirement for the phase out. And then we have a kind of an iteration process. And the crucial question, which I would like to address in the last few minutes, is how to address this and what kind of scheme is conceivable to come up with an iteration process which in the end leads to a ratchet up of the ambitions. So my argument is basically the following. The current national determined contributions are not transparent. This is also not new. It's known it's agreed and known by everybody. Countries determine targets with different means and different reference years. The nationally determined contributions are therefore not comparable. Emission reduction targets are based on the same year, means very different efforts depending on the development stage of a country. And the national determined contributions are not represented in most of the energy policies. So therefore, it seems to me it is worthwhile to think about a common metric which might be useful for compare the efforts among countries. And here I would like to start with an observation, and the observation is that we basically see around the globe a landscape of emerging carbon pricing systems. Weak carbon pricing systems, but just when China will basically implement their emission trading scheme in 2017, it's open to debate if it is implemented this year or next year, or it will be postponed another year. But nevertheless, when China will implement their emissions trading scheme, already 20% of all the emissions are then under a carbon pricing regulation scheme. So therefore, my proposal is we should start with this carbon pricing schemes. Why? Because carbon pricing are transparent. So it can be implemented either as a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. It has the same metric for all the countries, and it measures to counteract free riding as a principle of reciprocity and can be implemented relatively easy. And the carbon price drives energy investment, drives innovation, and makes more emission-intensive ways of production more costly and less attractive. So this is just a number of carbon pricing schemes. So this is basically a calculation which has been done by Potsdam Institute and the Remind group, which is represented here by Elmar Kriegler. And what you can see here is that basically by 2030 and 50, there are quite heterogeneous spread of carbon prices. So if we want to be consistent with the 2-degree target, we can live for the next decade with quite different and non-harmonized carbon prices, but after 2030, given the enormous ambition we have, we need a quite drastic increase of the carbon prices. If you show such a slide to the finance ministers, normally they are quite shocked. So the experience in Germany is a quite telling one. So you can tell to the politicians and say, oh, we want to reduce emissions by 2050, it's roughly at 80%, they say it gets okay. But if you say this would require a carbon price in the power sector of roughly 30 to 50 euros per ton CO2, then they are totally shocked. But after they recover from the shock, you could tell them another story. You could say, yes, it is true that basically the assets for coal, oil and gas owners will be reduced. But at the same time, carbon prices, and you can see this on the slide, creates a kind of revenues. Carbon revenues, you could call this a climate rent. And this climate rent and this carbon pricing revenues overcompensates in most of the countries the reduction of the values of the fossil fuel assets. And this is, from my point of view, a quite telling story, because this revenue from carbon pricing can be reduced either to reduce distortionary taxes, to reduce public debt, or to invest and use these carbon revenues for sustainable development goals. We have calculated that just a phase out of carbon subsidies would allow 70 countries around the globe just to invest a universal access to clean water. So the crucial thing is then, what has this to do with equity issues? And now I try to skip or to proceed my slides. It's not possible. So when I want, when I want to come to equity, so it becomes complicated. So the most important thing what I would like to argue is carbon pricing will not be successful if it is not complemented by a reasonable transfer scheme. And we thought very hard in our institutes, so what kind of transfer system could enhance international cooperation? So how should we use the 1 billion promised money in the Green Climate Fund, and how to increase this to make this operational? So we come up with the following proposal. The best way to incentivize the increase of carbon pricing in countries would be basically an equal effort principle. How can we implement this equal effort principle? So we could compare basically the mitigation costs which are required on an average basis around the globe, and if countries are above the average mitigation costs, they should be compensated by the Green Climate Fund or by another fund which provides this conditional transfers to countries who cannot afford a reasonable high carbon price. Countries who have mitigation costs below the average, so they will be then the donor countries. And again, what my colleagues from the Potsdam Institute have done in a quite interesting modeling comparison exercise, basically to calculate this equal effort sharing, it shows that basically a quite ambitious scenario could be affordable when the payments and the transfers in particular come from Europe and North America, and basically to channel transfers in order to allow countries to increase the carbon price. So in that sense, I would argue in the following way. First, the ambition ahead of us requires a quite dedicated policies. These dedicated policies cannot be implemented without international cooperation and coordination. Carbon prices are a metric to measure the efforts different countries can and will undertake. Over the next few years, we need increasing ambition, and this increasing ambition means increasing implicit or explicit carbon pricing schemes. Some countries, many countries, will not afford such carbon prices, and in order to make sure that we have an equal effort sharing, this requires a transfer scheme, which basically means countries who have higher mitigation costs should be subsidized and should be recipient countries from a conditional transfer scheme. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ottmar Edenhofer, and I'm delighted that Xolis and Guadla also made it here. It's sometimes very hard to get away from the negotiations, so we very much appreciate that you're with us. And we'll move on right now to Lukas Bretschke first, and then Xolisa will have the last presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I'm very honored to be here. I have entitled my presentation Productive Use of Equity Principles on a Global Level, and I can actually nicely put up and can get up with the ideas and many thoughtful considerations of my former speakers. We had results on the urgency of the issue. We had the resources that we have to leave in the ground. Then in the end, Ottmar Edenhofer talked about the mechanisms guiding us toward a probable system of global equity, and I wanted to extend, I wanted to elaborate a bit, and maybe stress some different effects. I will talk about prices, but as an economist I sometimes realize that this is not always well received, so I will rather talk on quantities, on carbon budgets, but of course this also has a price implication. It's mostly a matter of communication, but I think in the end it is also that prices can have a huge equity impact, and here of course observe this what many people don't see when they set high prices, that this might be a huge equity challenge. I start with the UNEP language, with the gaps. We all know that we have an emission gap, which is of course also an ambition gap, because policies are not sufficient. On the one hand, we have really temperature targets we believe in, we should achieve. On the other hand, as we all know, these nationally determined contributions, and also there, as an economist, I always have to defend in my profession that this makes a lot of sense, this bottom-up approach, because the first challenge was to have a broad participation. Basically everybody is on board now, so it's even that now Syria wants to be in the Paris Agreement, so we have basically all the countries on board, but as we have heard it before from the two former speakers, we still are not on track. We have to increase our ambition, and equity should be now one of the main mechanisms to bring us additional inputs to gain momentum in this whole process. We have also an assessment gap in the sense that we, on the one hand, based on the Paris Agreement, should see our progress on a global level. We have an aggregate, we check our emissions on the aggregate level. On the other hand, we are required to observe in light of equity criteria. We know in the convention that we have CBDR, the Combat with Differentiated Responsibilities requirement, and also the RC, the respective capabilities, and also the national circumstances which have come in the Paris Agreement. All these things go together. So the bottom line is about the country-specific contributions, but on the other hand, we have a global assessment, and then we have to find out that these two things do not yet go together, and we have to find mechanisms to bring them into more coherence, more consistent. Is equity important? Of course, it's important in the Paris Agreement. We have it at several important paragraphs. purpose mitigation, and then especially for the global stocktake, and this is where my contribution then will end today. How can we structure the discussion about the global stocktake on this equity discussion in a very productive way? Knowing that we have now moved, when we look at the policy assessment, in the first way from the country level to the global level. So there is an asymmetry, or you say there's a puzzle or is a conundrum. We say, on the one hand, we want to have a global assessment. We have only one globe equal one. And equity necessarily implies more than one part, so there's several parts. So we have to, of course, compare what different parties are doing. But not in the way it has been happening in the past. We have to find a new process which is a more productive process, so that we can have, in the end, increase in ambition, all a joint effort. So the open issues, when we start from here, from this puzzle, is can we derive in the future process a notion of global equity? When we compare the mitigation, adaptation efforts of the single parties, when we look at the provision of the means of implementation, of capacity building, can we bring this together in a way that in the end we will have a sense of a global equity? How we could do this in a sense that it is kind of a new, has a new flavor compared to the burden sharing, which is always, you know, the burden is something heavy and people, they think they have to suffer tremendously. But on the other hand, it's a chance sharing. We should see about it. We talked about the rents, but also in technologies, we have lots of opportunities. So can we reframe the discussion in a more productive way? And then finally, also importantly, can we assess what the different countries have promised, what they want to do, and what they are actually are doing? So can we use our metric, our common understanding when we apply it to what actually has been promised and what's actually done in current policies? This is basically our solution approach, not focus on a final global equity, but rather on a process. Because we don't have yet a common understanding, we have to establish first in a productive dialogue. We should have a broad exchange on equity issues, which has not happened until now. So we had a very distinct discussion in the parties, and some parties have had some considerations, but many don't really have something there. And we should do this as we have it now in a productive, inclusive dialogue, not finger pointing, not pointing single countries out, but develop together something which can be brought further. And the bottom line is also something which is, of course, well, it's really an intention, aim of us as scientists, that we should also, like in the temperature target discussion, include science and use the input of science in this equity dialogue. So this dialogue would have different parts. We could have on the first, for the next year, as we call it, inclusive, participatory and transparent dialogue, according to Talanoa, in a productive way. But this should be, according to our view, complemented by what we call, in light of equity, in the best available science. So then science would have a different, distinct impact on this dialogue. So on the one hand, of course, all the positive elements that we have now in the negotiations, plus something which adds from the scientific point of view on this equity dialogue. I would imagine that one could envisage something like a structured equity expert dialogue. We had the structured equity expert dialogue in previous years about IPCC and the parties, and now one could maybe broaden it. All the NGOs and all the scientists who have contributed to this equity discussion could bring in this at the joint meetings with the parties at the COP. So we could ensure that we have a scientific integrity of the dialogue, that parties learn what are the main issues there, and that we have a structure in the dialogue so that is not productive, not leading us to dead end. Something that we propose here is the CAP, the Climate Ambition Assessment Platform. This is something from which we will start now. But of course we are well aware that there are other initiatives, and this is good so. So we should have several who think about the common metric, who bring in their views on how these equity issues should be framed. And from the discussion among the peers, among the scientists, with the parties, we will learn something for the future. I will now quickly refer to what I see as a scientific background for the whole discussion, but then I will in the end, of course, focus on equity, because I think this is the most important in this context. Quickly about climate economics, because this will come back when we see the cost and benefit of the 2 and then 1.5 degrees Celsius target next year. I believe that the recent economic research has made substantial progress, because before we had a really distinct discussion at the COP and from climate physicists, we had the temperature targets, while the economists were always talking about optimal warming. Now we have learned, and we of course have taken into account that the previous discussion we have, we had a debate about discounting. Many models have not included risk in a proper way. Damage functions have been without a good foundation. Many things have not been included. One can say, to keep it short, that by developing the economic modeling about the climate change, we have a convergence, so that now also the temperature targets are well in line with what recent research has provided. And finally, also economists have learned to talk about these equity issues, which have been before basically, something which has not been considered within the economy. Within economists. Policy instruments, we do have prices, and I think the price is a very powerful and forceful instrument. Of course, we talk about uniform carbon prices, but at the same time, we always have to think about what are the equity implications. I will show this in a slide a bit later. We can also talk about quantities, which is easier for communication. We can talk about the carbon budget, because we know for every temperature target we have a carbon budget which is consistent, and then it is about the burden share. Well, it's about the cake eating, how much you allocate, how you allocate the different pieces of the cake. We can also use different policy mechanisms. You know, the norms, for example, for the cars have had a huge impact. Economists normally would favor the prices, but we can also, by implementing strong norms, we can have quite a huge impact on actually current development. And we can do this evaluation in terms of efficiency and also the equity. And we think that it's a strength if we leave the countries the decision how they want to implement this policy for their national circumstances. Can we think about enhancing the ambitions by forming country coalitions? Very briefly, I mean, we had the High Ambition Coalition, which has a tremendous impact in Paris. We had the idea of climate clubs, which came from the United States, from Nordhaus in Yale, and we had the idea always that the G7, G20, G whatever should also take the lead. I mean, these things have basically vanished in the last year, so we have to give up on these ideas, and I think we could form different coalitions. But you know, the problem of the coalition is if you have a few countries together, and if one of the players is not playing anymore, then of course this is a very vulnerable construct. So we could, of course, bring with a lower subsample of countries, we could have stricter rules, or we could have closer commitments, but of course this is very, this is of course very sensible if one big player is not clear. Now I'm coming to the final part, which is about how to now implement equity principles for guiding the process. The basic advantage of these equity principles is that we have them already implemented in national policies. We already know how they work. We have a tax, normally we have tax laws, we have burden sharing between regions and countries. So these are things which are known to people doing policy. They're part of expectations. We can verify them, and now we can apply them to the climate negotiating process and reduce distribution, income distribution. One should give those a merit who contribute for solving problems. And then going back to Aristotle, one should compare like with like. This has much to do with economic development. One should also look at available technologies. We have now the possibility to apply new green technologies, and of course now to implement a new coal power plant has a different meaning than it was in the last century. So based on these things, we can develop a metric which is still flexible, but which gives kind of a guidance. And we can compare this metric with something that has also been proposed, and now come back to the equity issue with the global carbon tax, the global carbon price, and the egalitarian allocation of the carbon budget. So here on this slide, you see a comparison of three principles. The green one, the straight one, would be when you implement carbon taxes and have the tax revenues fully spent within a country. The egalitarian, the red one, would be if you implement an equal distribution of global carbon budget. And you see that the blue one, the one that we're proposing, the equity-based, is kind of a compromise in the middle. And it has very good reason that we can we should not implement one or the other extreme, but we should stay in the middle. So the carbon budget will be distributed according to a compromise. For the platform that we are proposing, we think we should include all the countries, which should provide basic data, and we should propose such a common metric, but we should still be flexible in the sense that we want to talk about which of these equity principles should be included and how much should be the weights. And we would also then find out what is the flexibility, what is the robustness of our results with respect when we change a bit the different, different weights. Historic responsibility, when do we start, and how much do we weight economic development? So this would be to provide the basic information about policy achievements. We could exchanges between countries, and then we could especially also exchange the best policy practices. I'm almost there. I wanted to give a hint at the foundation. We have developed a climate calculator. As I said before, we know that there are other mechanisms to do this, but this could give reference to such a process, that you're invited to check it out for yourself if you like to see how this would contribute. This is my last slide. So this would say now, when we take the data work, when we take the exchange of best available policies, and when we take all the full input of science and take this into this COP negotiating process together with the parties, then we could frame a productive process, finally leaving us and converging to a global equity. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. So Lisa, when you didn't show up initially, I said, well, we need somebody to talk about adaptation and equity, and we had to decide that we'll have to reorganize another meeting. So, but now we're very pleased that you're with us, and look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, and of course apologies for being late. I trust you understand the competing demands that we have during these sessions. So how I've structured my presentation has been to look at the concept of equity pre-2015 and the concept of equity post the Paris Agreement, and opportunities that we have in operationalizing this concept, especially in the context of the Global Stocktake. And there's many formulations and permutations and proposals that you may have seen over the years. And however, they've been, they had issues with getting traction in the context of negotiations, primarily because the concept of equity has a philosophical base, which is not easy to explain in a consistent manner across different circumstances. And in that regard, the African group going to Paris proposed what we refer to as the equity reference framework. This was a three-pronged approach that we put forward, which basically said, if we have a temperature target or we have a temperature goal, there's a basis upon which we can understand how much do we need to invest in mitigation to achieve the required emission pathways, as well as what is the impact risk that is associated with that temperature. And through that understanding, you can address the first part of the methodology, which is understanding what the required efforts are. The second part of it looked at a concept of relative fair efforts to say, now understanding what needs to be done, who should be doing what. And the proposal that we put forward had three sets of criteria and multiple metrics that could be used. The first one was the concept of historical responsibility. The second one being current capability, and the last one being development needs or development goals that developing countries have. So if one have metrics that address those three components, our proposition was that we can be able to have a basis of assessing fair efforts towards that required global effort. However, there were a number of points of divergence amongst parties going to Paris. The first one was on the scope, questions of do we do this equity assessment on the basis of mitigation or adaptation or support or any other consideration, or is it a combination of all? Of course, in our view, it's that global climate action includes all these aspects. It's not limited to one or the other. However, we couldn't agree on that aspect. That was a key point of divergence. The second one was metrics used. Okay? As you might imagine, there's a number of metrics that we had even in previous presentations of proxies for understanding what will constitute a basis of assessing what is equitable. The third point pertained to the proposal focused on individual efforts or relative fair efforts that parties should undertake, and the paradigms of a top-down system vis-a-vis a bottom-up system was one of the points of divergence in respect of this proposal. However, post-Paris, I think we are in a different world in that the Paris Agreement in itself has got some nice provisions pertaining to equity, starting from the preambular paragraph, going to the article on global peaking of emissions, including the stocktake, saying the stocktake will be undertaken in light of science and equity. So there has been some progress in that regard. And secondly, the practice that we have seen, because sometimes in intergovernmental processes, we are so threatened about what we don't know. Once we start doing it, we start thinking, actually, this may not necessarily be such a bad thing. In Lima, we agreed that when parties communicate their INDCs, they should provide minimum information that explains why they believe that their contributions are ambitious and fair. Interestingly enough, as much as we were saying we can't have metrics that can represent equity, etc., etc., we don't have more than 6 criteria that were identified by parties in their INDCs. So which means this is not necessarily an insurmountable problem. And secondly, which is key to equity and the proposal that we had put forward, is that it requires a definition of a temperature goal and an interpretation of what that means in respect of mitigation, adaptation, and support. And if you look at Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, it sets a temperature goal, 2 degrees, pursuing 1.5, and then it outlines mitigation, adaptation, as well as the required financial flows to achieve this effort. So obviously, we are in a different world than we were before Paris in respect of how the concept of equity can be operationalized in the Paris Agreement. But now we need to start looking at the practicalities of the negotiating process, particularly in respect of Article 14, the Global Stocktake, on how do we move from the abstract to the practical using what we know and what we have done. In that issue, I just want to quickly remind you of what we differed on. First one was scope, metrics, and the issue of sovereignty. You know that it is not desirable for the multilateral process to kind of instruct a country that this is how much you need to do. That's not very palatable. However, I will just show you a few things that respond to some of those differences that we had prior to Paris. Firstly, on scope, both in Article 2 and Article 14, there's a clear understanding that the scope is comprehensive. So the scope divergence that we had is no longer an issue as it was prior to Paris. So that's point 1. Point number 2, as I indicated, in respect of criteria for equity, as much as when I was reading some INDCs, you know, there were parties that I would sit in a room and they would say, you can't have a criteria for equity. But when I read their INDC, they had something like GDP per capita, our cumulative emission, our capability is limited. All these issues that parties were saying are impossible, actually they reflected them. With respect to the 3 broad categories that we have in the equity reference framework, the one that was reflected in proxy was the concept of development needs. A lot of parties use the concept of we are vulnerable as a proxy of the development gap that they are facing. So that's one of, so in essence, all those three dimensions that were identified are actually captured in the criteria that parties had addressed. On the third point on sovereignty, Paris embedded a concept of national determination. And as I will show in my next slide, it is well considered in how we can build equity into the global stocktake, in that there is no top-down perspective. And secondly, the global stocktake as designed in the Paris Agreement is collective in nature, it's not individual, but the proposal that we have provides for a process through which you undertake the global stocktake to ensure that you've got a balance between these two approaches. Key to that is the fact that this should be self-applied by parties. So parties should continue choosing their metrics. However, as I will show in a later slide, the only thing that gets done in the multilateral process is to use that specific metric as a proxy to say, if you choose emissions per capita as your indicator, consistent with 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius, what is the global average? And then you allow parties to go back to their domestic constituencies and say, this is where we are, this is where the global average should be, and that provides a basis of discussion with regards to the concept of equity. So to get to the more boring detail, I would imagine, which is what happens in the negotiations, to get this scheme that I'm referring to working, one will have to address it in two parts of the mandate on the agenda item on the global stocktake. The first one will be that there is a need to develop guidelines on how to compute the metrics or the criteria that have been identified by parties. So we use as a starting point the synthesis report that the Secretariat prepared on the aggregate impact of NDC. The second aspect would be a technical assessment in the process of the global stocktake to say, for each of the different metrics, this is what they mean in relation to the temperature scenario. And Article 14.3 of the Paris Agreement say, following the stocktake, parties should enhance or update their NDCs. So parties having had an opportunity to see where their metric put them with regards to where the world should be, should serve as a basis of them engaging their domestic constituencies as well as their peers in the international arena. As such, start that cycle of increasing ambition across all elements, whether it's adaptation action, mitigation action, or provision of finance. From an input perspective, the inputs into the stocktake will therefore have to be a synthesis of each of these aspects, a synthesis of the mitigation component of NDCs to understand where they take us in relation to the specific metrics, as well as in relation with adaptation, as well as the provision in Article 9.5 of the Paris Agreement on the requirement for developed countries to biennially communicate indicative support to developed countries. So if you've got these three metrics, then you've got a sense of where we are in relation to where we need to do. And as the African group, we think we need to build on what is already on the table. So if we have a technical paper by the Secretariat that looks at these 6 or so criteria that have been used by parties, they can articulate dozens of metrics that talk to each of those, which parties can nationally determine which one they are going to use. But the important thing is the method of preparing those should be multilaterally agreed. And the last point will be ensuring that on the information or the guidance for the preparation of subsequent NDCs, there is a linkage of how one generates the information that parties will communicate in the first place. So I hope with that reflection of where we were and what conditions we have now and what simple solutions we have, that we can be able to operationalize this otherwise abstract concept. So thank you, Stefan.
to all of you. We have now 20 minutes left for a discussion and based on questions coming from you all. Yes, please. I think we have 2 microphones.
Yeah, thank you, Elmar Kriegler, Potsdam Institute. Thanks a lot for the inspiring presentations. You made clear 2 points. One is, in order to have this ambitious mitigation strategy and also adaptation, we need effort sharing. And the second one is, those equity issues are not going away due to the fact that we have a bottom-up approach now, as it will be an integral part of the global stocktake. So, what I'm interested in, that's my question, is, of course, thinking about equity, you can easily come up with a top-down approach where you agree on a principle and then allocate, which doesn't have a good track record in international negotiations. So my basic question is there a bottom-up approach to equity? And I think the last presenter actually, you went in this direction and talked about such a bottom-up approach. So I would like to hear also the views of the other speakers. What do they think of this bottom-up approach? And secondly, is there a place for a coalition of countries that would then adopt standards on metrics, like the high ambition coalition? Could there be a high equity standard coalition, and would that be helpful in the process?
Thank you, Lindsay Cook from the Quaker United Nations office. Much of the discussion, naturally being a multilateral negotiation, is about what nation states can and should do. But we are aware that a significant percentage of GHG emissions are created by multinational companies, which often lie outside nation state regulation. My question, are states considering a multilateral approach to multinational accountability on GHG emission responsibility, helping states' efforts to address mitigation, equity, and climate finance gaps? And which carbon tax model best addresses this polluter pays approach, if at all? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could we have a third question? Otherwise we'll move to... Yes, please.
Collective. I'm struggling a bit with the no fossil fuels in terms of no more jobs, no more steel, no more cement. So what role do you see for collecting emissions in terms of carbon capture and storage rather than the ACT alliance, what looks very dramatic? You can't have fossil fuels anymore. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have questions that address all the panelists. Maybe we'll just start. Right.
It's stark. We can't do with it, but so we have to rapidly put in place what we have now. We have to rapidly invest in research and technology. We've got the sort of lower, electricity can do that. Therefore, vehicles, you can do that. There are harder ones. Can we do low carbon insulation, housing, domestic? Can we do that next level of industry? We actually have to start dealing, and I think this is part of this discussion has to go from bickering, what can I do, or what are you doing, you're not doing that, into actually what can we do together. And actually, I believe we can, investing in carbon capture and storage is investing in old technology. It can be still using old technology for longer and longer and longer, instead of really investing in the technology of the future, the efficient ones, the renewable ones, the ones that use local resources, not these multilateral corrupt sources. And you think but you have to, there is no CCS technology that is working to scale at the moment, and there isn't that's working to scale to hide away our problem for the future. So it is genuinely, currently finance is propping up the fossil fuel industry. We have to find the incentives to show the risk of doing that. We have to really find, I think that links to the multilaterals, we really need to expose the risk, and that's risk of investing in an old-fashioned technology, something that's outdated, something we can't use anymore, but also the risk of continuing to use fossil fuels and dirty fuels, which are damaging people, vulnerable people around the world. We have to face, that's what I was saying, face up to that real ambition, that real effort that needs to be done, and not pretend that we can just patch up old. I think we need an open discussion on it, and I think we need to not hide from talking about fossil fuels. Governments don't want to talk fossil fuels because they're scared it will affect their economy. Instead of planning for that transition, would be my view.
Thank you very much, Alison Doig. We had a question to the two economists regarding equity issues to not go away, how to pursue a bottom-up approach.
Okay, thank you. When I may start, very like the question. Thank you for this idea, and I think I agree with the last speaker. We also have, of course, in this area, follow the bottom-up approach. We have to see how far we can go, but in the end, we also must acknowledge that the bottom-up approach so far did not fully deliver. We had a broad participation, but our temperature goals cannot be reached. So we have kind of to see by both sides. Of course, we do not want to impose top-down some metric which we have found out in our research lab, but we want to kind of provide a structure which is flexible enough, but which is still comprehensive and which is still kind of meaningful as a menu to offer. And then the parties and the different stakeholders can together find out how much they want to value each of these criteria. And this could be a very productive process. And I very much like also the idea of a coalition of high equity standard countries. This could exactly trigger this momentum. One could implement this with a limited sample of countries and see how far this can go. And if this is developed countries, they could also trigger some technologies. We heard it before, we need some technical progress. But I mean, this technical progress does not fall from heaven. In most cases, think of war times, how creative people become when they want to implement a war machinery. Of course, is a bad comparison. But when we have urgency in the need of new technologies, and we implement high equity standards and say the carbon budget is now very tightly limited, then we will find new technologies. Technology already are there in many cases, and in other cases we still have to improve on them. But this actually could exactly trigger these momentum effects which we basically need in the end to have the temperature targets achieved.
Yeah, thank you very much for the three questions. So let me start with a top-down and bottom-up and effort sharing. I see basically two fundamental justifications for equity. The first one is you could start and say, I want to find a justice norm, and basically you argue then from a justice theory, from a philosophy of justice, what's the appropriate equity norm. And admittedly, so there is no universal norm, so there are several norms available, but it's a limited amount. A second approach is you want to have an equity norm which enhances cooperation. And these are different things, very, very different things. And Lucas showed this. So if you are an egalitarian from a purely philosophical point of view, there are good reasons to be an egalitarian. But if you want to have a middle ground, I would argue for a middle ground because we need an equity principle which enhances international cooperation. Because this is what is desperately needed when we want to achieve these very, very ambitious goals. It's a little bit more modest, a little bit more moderate, but this has also a chance to emerge from a kind of a bottom-up process. And what I would like to, I like Lucas' proposal very much, to start thinking about equity from the rightness of procedure instead of just thinking about the goodness of outcome. But in the end, we have to combine both things and to evaluate what are the implications of the principle. I would argue people always want to see the implication of a norm, and then they could agree on the norm. And therefore, I have a tendency to say effort sharing, equal effort sharing, is something which could be a reasonable focal point along the lines just enhancing international cooperation. The second question, national states and multinationals, and what's the appropriate carbon pricing scheme. I think, so there are basically two fundamental approaches for that. The first one is, you say a country, a subset of countries imposes a carbon tax, and then there are other countries who have no carbon tax, and then you need a kind of a border tax adjustment. I have to say, and I have to admit, I'm not a big fan of border tax adjustments, and I'll tell you why. Because what we see is in many countries that the export sector is much less carbon intensive than in many countries the domestic sector. If you have a lot of border tax adjustment, you basically penalize the relative carbon efficient sectors, which is not good at all. So therefore, instead of saying we want to have border tax adjustments, I very much favor an approach which basically says we want to integrate this different carbon pricing schemes regularly, because then you can mitigate all the competitiveness issues, and then in the end, under such a regulation, you have also the multinationals included. So that would be, from my point of view, the preferable approach. And again, like a carbon emission gap report, why not having annually a carbon pricing report? So we basically have now 20% of emissions under a carbon pricing regulation. So what can we do to fill this gap and to include more emissions from different sectors? So this has been already carried out by the World Bank and other institutions, but I would like to see a convergence of the gap reports, of the different emission gap reports and the carbon pricing reports. The role of CCS, here with all the politeness, I strongly disagree with you, because carbon capture and storage probably will play an important role in the future. And this is not to say, I strongly disagree with you, that this is just an investment in an almost outdated technology. This might be the case in the case of coal, but even in the case of coal, carbon capture and storage could help. Think about negative emissions. If you want to achieve a 1.5-degree target, this is not feasible without negative emissions. Not feasible without negative emissions. And the negative emissions technology we know already very likely have some carbon capture and storage component, like the combination of biomass and carbon capture and storage. There is absolutely no way to achieve a 1.5-degree target without negative emissions. And also industry emissions, process emissions, are something which has to be compensated. I'm not arguing, at least in Europe or in other parts, we should push for coal CCS, but at least for industry CCS and in the combination with bioenergy, we should have at least pilot projects. I know you disagree with me, but you should think about, if you are a strong proponent of the 1.5-degree target, I tell you, and I go into a big fight with you, so that without negative emissions is not possible. That's not possible. Okay, but this is the only disagreement that I have here.
So thank you very much. I don't know if you want to have the big fight right now. So Lisa, would you like to answer any of those questions?
Just to reflect on the first one, I think what I was presenting was precisely to express the difficulty of a purely top-down approach. The track record that you referred to, in that it has not been that great because there has not been traction. But with conditions that we have now, you basically can establish a workable balance of both national determination, allow countries to choose the metrics that they would like to use, but now have this benchmarking process of saying, you've made your choice, however, this is how you generate that information, and this is how you assess yourself. So you are self-applying equity metrics rather than a third party telling a party what to do. However, in the Global Stocktake, I think there is space for the creative calculators, as well as equity reviews that civil society does, etc., to further illustrate or help parties to do a self-assessment on these aspects. If there will be a high equity standard coalition, I think there's a number of African countries that would join you on that one. On the question from Lindsay about the question of nation states vis-a-vis multinational company emissions. I think purely from a negotiation perspective, because this is an intergovernmental process and that a lot of the activities that are undertaken, they are in some sovereign territory that is part of the UNFCCC system. So one way or the other, those are counted for domestically. So it will be domestic policies, nationally determined policies that will determine how that is dealt with. But that raises a very interesting question, because as far back as 2007, when it comes to the concept of equity, there were questions around not accounting emissions on the basis of where they come from, but where the consumption is, because that changes the picture quite drastically. Because if you look at a country like China, for example, high emissions because it's the factory of the world, but who's consuming those products? Increasingly, there's a lot of Chinese consuming those products, but primarily these are consumed elsewhere. So there are a lot of tricky issues and pitfalls, you know, when it comes to how one deals with these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we won't get into a big fight, but just a small discourse. So, Alison Doig, you have to.
Well, I just wanted to come back on the BECS issue. I think if you want to get into a huge equity agenda, BECS will be it, because it needs massive, that means growing masses of crops, burning them and then storing the carbon. Where are those land going to be taken? I mean, the acreage is just unimaginable if you go down that route. So whose land is it going to be? Whose food is it going to replace? So I think the equity issues associated are absolutely huge. I think there are many, many options for mitigating rapidly, fast. We have to exhaust all of those before we even think about going down a route like that. But as I say, from the equity point of view, I think that would be quite explosive.
No, I think you're raising a very important point, but let me highlight the following. So I do not deny the enormous challenge, but it would be good if we could agree. So a 1.5 degree target is basically, in a worst case scenario, we basically have to compensate each ton of CO2 which we're emitting now, we have to compensate it later if we want to achieve this target. And I'm not saying that negative emissions are a kind of a mean or a tool where we can postpone mitigation. Not at all. We have to start rapidly, we have to start now. We need all the advanced renewable technologies. There is no doubt about this. We need storage technologies. But if you read all this, and I'm not saying this, I'm not on the payroll of one of the large fossil fuel suppliers. What I'm saying is, for a 1.5 degree target, it is very, 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 very unlikely you can do it without negative emissions. You have to answer also this question. And what I'm saying is, if you think about bioenergy, biofuels in the first generation, so this cannot be done. You need a lot of pilot projects, you need a lot of research and development, and I fully understand what you are saying, that you cannot do it in a way which is irresponsible. You have a lot of land conversion and all sorts of things. I do not deny the enormous social problems, but this is partially an implication of the 1.5 degree target. And I think this can be manageable, but this is a really, really huge challenge.
Thank you very much. We're slowly getting to the end. Farid, we have 1.5 minutes left, so.
Okay. Well, I have to apologise that I haven't been in the whole session, but there's just one point, very brief point I wanted to raise, and then a question. The point to raise was that I believe at the summit of the local and regional governments at COP in a few days' time, they'll actually be agreeing a framework for locally developed contributions, for locally defined contributions. And I think it's really important that, thinking about the kind of models that you're talking about, that there's the provision for, say, California to be able to participate and be included in this process. So I think it's crucial, and perhaps talking about that is a useful thing. And my question is really, if you're going to come to a total point of equity, and this comes to the gentleman, the end's point about consumption, really is the only equitable end point, if not the process by which you get there, being a carbon ration, a carbon budget for each person on this planet? And isn't that really the only equitable result? And that surely has to be based on consumption, and that also allows you to rein in the multinationals.
look at the colleagues in the back of the room. Do we have another few minutes? 1 minute. Okay. So.
Very quickly, I don't think that basically allocate a carbon budget equally among all the citizens on planet Earth is doing justice.
No, I'm not saying that. That's the end point.
But in the end, what I would say is, even from a negotiation process, if you negotiate just about this carbon budget, you create a zero-sum game. I think you will not achieve anything. What we should do instead is we should embed the justice and the equity and the effort-sharing issue in a much broader framework, where we should also include the sustainable development goals and show people, for example, what is the potential, for example, of carbon pricing to finance sustainable development goals, increasing human well-being. It seems to me this is a much more productive path forward than just to allocate a given budget and creating a zero-sum game.
Okay, thank you very much. Some of us just came out of the negotiations on the Global Stocktake. Equity was a big topic, and I think we'll need your advice over the next few years. Thank you very much. So I pass the floor on to Delmar Bueno de Faria, the General Secretary of ACT Alliance, to close our meeting.
Thank you very much. We had some disagreements, but most agreements as well. And in terms of we need to be ambitious in these negotiations if you want to reach the target of 1.5. That is absolutely we need to do. And for doing that, we need global cooperation and partnerships on mainly based on the existing political frameworks like the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sendai framework for disaster risk reductions. But also we know that we need political will, especially from governments, but also the private sector, but also political pressure, advocacy from different parts, even to address issues related to the role of the multinationals and transnational companies as well in contributing for this. And we need also to have evidence or science-based processes in this process, in these discussions. But one thing that's common, we know that we have only one planet, and there are human beings living on this planet. If we will not take this seriously, we will not address any issue related to equality, not only in terms of the negotiations, but also in terms of the equality in the more human dignity perspective. We, on behalf of the government of Switzerland and the ACT Alliance, we thank you very much for participating of this event, and we hope that that has somehow contributed for your discussions internally and in the negotiations as well. Have a good evening, and we'll see you next year.